The North American winter of 1609 to 1610 was a particularly brutal one, known today as the Starving Time. This winter occurred after a severe drought, which led to famine, which ultimately led to food shortages becoming so scarce that by the spring of 1610 had taken the lives of 80% of the colony. So the year is 1609, and James VI of Scotland, also known as James I of England and Ireland, has been the King of Great Britain and Ireland for the last 6 years. But I don't really want to talk about James VI/First today, as we'll get to him in my Stuart series eventually. Just suffice to say, it's because of James VI/First that I tend to go around saying that Scotland technically founded America because, well, he's Scottish, and it was under his reign that the British colonisation of America began. This leads us to his namesake, Jamestown. Jamestown of the Virginia colony was the first permanent settlement to come out of what would become Britain in America. Some people call this the first English settlement, and sure, you can say that, but just be aware the King of England at the time was Scottish. Jamestown was originally established as James Fort on May the 4th, 1607. This fort days later would move to a more defensive position along a nice curve down the River James, which was large enough for wharfs on the water and various other constructions along the riverbank. Although I refer to it as Jamestown, please be aware it would keep the name James Fort until 1619, when it would officially change name to Jamestown. The location also had the benefit of being away from the native Powhatan Confederacy, who did not use the area due to its inability to provide fertile farmland. The settlement at Jamestown, all bar the events of the Starving Time, was considered a permanent settlement and the capital of the Virginia colony for 83 years, from 1616 to 1699. It is for this reason it is considered the first true settlement of America, as unlike the earlier colony of Roanoke, this one after its horrible hungry winter would still exist as a location on the map. But before we get ahead of ourselves and start talking about how prosperous this settlement would become, let's stop and look at the moment that almost made this settlement as doomed as the Roanoke colony. So this takes us to May 13th, 1607, and the first group of colonists, consisting of 104 men from 3 ships under the command of Christopher Newport, would arrive at James Fort. The problems that would cripple the colony a few winters later would start immediately, as it was decided before leaving Britain that the colonists would not produce the majority of their own food, which was evident from the fact most of the colonists were not accustomed to manual labour or familiar with farming. Sure, they did farm a little, but their strategy was mostly based around trading with the native Powhatan confederacies to survive between supply ships from England. Unfortunately, the new defensive position they chose along the river was an area prone to swamp, bringing an army of insects with it that lacked the animal population to sustain hunting, was useless for growing crops, and only provided brackish water. To top all that off, it was also a particularly dry rain season. Christopher Newport would return for England, leaving the colonists at James Fort, and would not return until January. During that time, a series of incidents with the natives had developed into serious conflict, ending with little trade they did have, and forced the settlers to remain inside their camps, under fear of being kidnapped or killed by the natives as they went out to forage or hunt. By December, the food shortages became so bad a character named John Smith set out along the Chickahominy River looking for food. Smith being quite a character, as during the voyage to the New World, Smith was charged with mutiny and sentenced to be executed, until they arrived at James Fort and unsealed orders from the Virginia Company of London, the financier of the colony, stating that Smith was a leader of the new colony. So yeah, pretty awkward. Anyway, that December, whilst out looking for food, he was captured and taken to Wairarwokomoko, where he would meet Wahan Seneca, the leader of the Powhatan, also sometimes simply just referred to as the Powhatan. Anyway, John Smith, colonist and possible mutineer, is about to have his head crushed in by the Powhatan, and it's big fuck-off club when the most unusual of things happens. History goes all Disney, quite literally. The Powhatan's 11-year-old daughter, Pocahontas, yes, that Pocahontas, threw her head on top of John Smith's, preventing her father from executing him. But this isn't as Disney as the Disney story, as although John Smith would be freed unharmed, no less, Pocahontas would be captured in 1613 by the English. A year later, she would have converted to Christianity, renamed herself Rebecca, and married a tobacco planter named John Rolfe. A year after that, she bore their only son, Thomas Rolfe, and a year beyond that, she would be in London being shown off as an example of a civilized savage. A year after that, aged 20 or 21, she would die and be buried in England, so Disney, but only in the literal sense that Disney made a movie based loosely on the events, as the true story of Pocahontas wasn't a particularly long one. Anyway, by the time Newport arrived in January 1608 with more supplies and 100 new colonists, he discovered his original colony had been more than halved, with only 38 of his original colonists remaining. To make it even more bleak, one of the new colonists accidentally set fire and destroyed the colony's living quarters, and further stressed their already limited resources. Newport spent the next few months expanding fortifications, reinforcing and rebuilding shelters, and placing armed guards to defend crops from Indian attacks. He would then return to England in April and would not be back with more supplies until October. When Newport returned in October, he brought with him the colony's first 2 women, but also more importantly, craftsmen to help keep the colony functioning. Newport didn't hang around and would again be back on his way to England. Once back in England, the Virginia Company of London had issued a new flagship, the Sea Venture. This flagship would be the largest of the 9 ships, with 500 more colonists and supplies, destined to sail for James Fort. The fleet would leave London on June 2nd, 1609, however, whilst crossing the Atlantic, the fleet encountered a storm that lasted 3 days. The Sea Venture would be blown off course and lose the fleet before having to be deliberately driven onto the reefs in Bermuda to stop the ship sinking and allow the crew to disembark safely. Another smaller ship would lose the rest of the fleet and return to London. The rest of the ships, however, would arrive at Jamesport, but by doing so only added to the problem, as the Sea Venture was carrying most of the supplies, being the largest of the ships, and the smaller ships that did arrive mostly carried the new colonists. This brought the number of mouths needing to be fed to a dangerously high number relative to the quantity of food they had available. And this is where the story becomes exceptional. As to my knowledge, it is the only evidence we have found that suggests British people were involved in cannibalism, or perhaps more accurately, necrophagia. So what do we know? We know Jane was a 14-year-old colonist at Jamestown, and she was most likely eaten. We know the colony was struggling for food and that there was a drought which led to famine, which led to the colonists eating the domesticated animals, including cats, dogs and horses, before moving on to the snakes and rats, and eventually people like Jane. We know Jane's bones shows marks on scars consistent with cannibalism, with what appears to be an amateur hastily attempt to strip the flesh from the bones and gain access to the brain before it starts to rot and become inedible. Plenty of indentations and scrapes that not only help confirm the hypothesis she was eaten, but also help prove the 5 historical count of Jamestown cannibalism to most likely be true. There were shallow cuts on the forehead and jaw, suggesting not an ounce of flesh was wasted, highlighting, as if the act itself wasn't enough, just how incredibly desperate these people had become for survival. The back of the head eventually cracked open with a hatchet, and eventually all of Jane, including her cheeks, tongue, face and brain, would be consumed. From isotope studies on one of Jane's molars, it has been established she was most likely from a high status family, or at least served one as a maid. The high nitrogen content of the molar tends to indicate a lot of protein, which we know was scarce and expensive at the time. We also know Jane was probably from the southern coast of England, and that she probably hadn't been in Jamestown for a very long time, as carbon isotopes on her bones indicate that she had been eating mostly a European diet. The reason I brought up the difference in definition between cannibalism and necrophagia is due to the fact that it seems likely Jane had already died before she was eaten. So that's nice, but to be honest, it is the winter that would still be known 400 years later as the starving time, so I guess it isn't too much of a stretch to imagine enough people would have been dying to negate the need to commit murder for their flesh. So how did this terrible story end? Well, back in Bermuda, the shipwrecked sailors of the Sea Venture fitted the longboat with the mast and set it to sail to find Virginia. However, its crew would never be seen again. Luckily for the remaining few at Jamestown, the survivors of the Sea Venture who didn't get on the first ship spent the next 9 months building 2 new ships, the Deliverance and Patience. Then, leaving 2 men behind to secure England's claim to Bermuda, they sailed for Virginia. The Sea Venture, just going through their own 9 months of hell, was expecting to see a thriving colony once they got to Virginia, but when they arrived it was basically in ruins and abandoned. Of the 500 or so colonists who were there the autumn before, only 60 would survive to see the Sea Venture come to port. To make matters worse, many of the supplies destined for Jamestown had been lost when the Sea Venture shipwrecked in Bermuda, meaning only a small portion of the food made its way to Jamestown. It was this decision that made Sir Thomas Gates, the new governor, on the 7th of June 1610 to declare they would return to England. However, unknown to them, the publication of John Smith's book had renewed interest in the Jamestown colony from England. And a few months earlier, in April, 3 more ships were dispatched from England with additional colonists, a doctor, food and supplies, headed by Thomas West, Baron de Delaware, or more commonly known today as Lord Delaware. Lord Delaware and his 3 ships would arrive on the James River on June 9th, just as the Deliverance and Patience were sailing downstream and leaving Virginia. They were intercepted 10 miles downstream from Jamestown, and Lord Delaware, now in charge as governor, ordered the Deliverance and Patience to return to the abandoned colony. This naturally wasn't a popular decision at the time, but it would lead to events that would come later, such as John Rolfe marrying Pocahontas and her eventual trip to and death in England. John Rolfe would also then go on to become an incredibly successful tobacco farmer. The settlement from then on would prosper with the arrival of Lord Delaware's substantial armed force of Protestants, which resulted in a counter-offensive against the Powhatan Confederacy. The previously mentioned marriage between Pocahontas and John Rolfe would provide a brief peace, and it was only brief. However, it was just long enough for the English to fully secure the colony's fortifications and housing, expand its farming, develop a network of alliances with other local Native Americans, and establish a series of smaller outlying settlements. And from here, things only seemed to look up for the settlers of Jamestown. As the tobacco business boomed, so did the colony. Obviously, this picture isn't quite so pretty from the Powhatan perspective, with another 2 Anglo-Indian wars still to follow over the next 40 years. But that will have to be a story for another day, as I'm going to assume you have lives outside of listening to tales about Pocahontas and British cannibalism in the Americas.